Good afternoon. We're going to do Chapter 11's Lecture A. Chapter 11 deals with the peculiar situation known as, or institution known as slavery. We'll focus this lesson on how did slavery shape social and economic relations in the Old South, what were the legal material constraints of slaves' lives and work. We'll focus on how distinct slave cultures emerged in the Old South and what were the major forms of resistance to slavery. Okay. One of the early things, introduction to American rose more dramatically during the self-made period than Frederick Douglass. If you study African-American history, one of the most famous early African-Americans is going to be Frederick Douglass, who rose from slavery, rags to riches, and was very successful. Slave mother, an unknown white man, so he was what we call a mulatto or half white, half black. Very common for slave women to be raped by white men and have children. Those children did not have a lot of rights and were kind of stuck in limbo often in the legal system. He became a prominent figure in the abolition movement and will really come to be the representation that we most obviously think during this period leading up and during the Civil War of abolition. The Old South, after abolition in North, slavery had become the peculiar institution of the South, being primarily located in the South. Most of the northern states will either eliminate slavery altogether or have it very, very low. This will occur around the Mason-Dixon line that run parallel to the country, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia area. 4 million slaves on the eve of the Civil War were in the country, primarily in the South. Nearly 1/3 of the South's population came from the slave population, thus why the 3/5 compromise was so vital and important to the South. Now, this is going to be driven by cotton. Cotton is the king in the 19th century. Cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor. The British abolished slavery in 1833 and it made America the center of the slave market or trade in the New World. Now, 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the South during this period, thus a lot of money came into the South. Now, that money did not get distributed amongst all classes, but was primarily isolated in the upper plantation class, and thus why they fought so hard to keep slavery in place. The second Middle Passage, the first Middle Passage was the original importation of slaves from Africa. The second one was more than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860 in the South. Families were often broken up and a lot of selling like cattle. Not all families were broken up. Not all plantation owners were that heartless, but many were, and many found life elsewhere apart from their family. The selling and movement of slaves internally was just internally in the South, with very little movement to the North. Slavery in the nation. The North's rise was helped by cotton, primarily because shipping, tariff, revenue, taxes, etc. helped finance improvements in the North. The money that the cotton generated will find its way to the North, and that's the primary way the North benefited from this. The Southern economy. The Upper South was much more diverse in industry than the Deep South. This included cities such as St. Louis, Baltimore, and Richmond that had some industry or some factories combined with some slavery. The Deep South ran from South Carolina to Texas, and that's where you're going to find the cotton fields. Not surprisingly, Deep South was dependent on cotton, and the first state to leave the Union would be South Carolina, that was heavily dependent on cotton. Slavery amended the South's industrial development. New Orleans was the only major large city in the Deep South, primarily because it existed before the rise of cotton, and it was on the Mississippi River. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina stated, "No peer on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." The Old South 3. Now, cotton is very much endowed in whatever the South did. Plain folk of the Old South economy, slavery shaped race relations, politics, religion, and the law. Nothing escaped and not much changed. So literally for about 70, 80 years, not much changed in the South. And even if you go further back on the colonization of South Carolina, North Carolina, you're going to see a very rigid class structure. And at the bottom is slaves. Above them is poor whites, which is a large portion, a very few middle class, and a very small upper class. That being said, you're looking at a very, very feudalistic society almost. 3 out of 4 white families did not own slaves, and most lived very rural, self-sustaining lives, and thus were just kind of like common farmers. Was a rift between common folk and the rich planters at the time? Like I alluded to, it's almost feudalistic. The planters controlled the politics. They moved and shaped everything that was going on. Most, though, believed their economic and personal freedom rested on slavery, and what kept the poor whites in check was this idea that slavery led to some of their success, or at least some of their freedoms, though it may be limited, and that if they were free, they would lose some rights and economic opportunities. Now, as also, slavery was tied to race. No matter if you had a free black, everything was tied back to race, and thus subhuman. The planter class in 1850, most slaveholding families owned 5 or less slaves. Fewer than 40,000 families possessed the 20 more required to be qualified as a planter. 2,000 or less had over 100 slaves and constructed elaborate homes and sizes. And this is the plantations with the big rows that you would think about coming in. So you can see there's a very distinct class structure within the South, very dependent on how slavery is embodied there. Going to the Old South 4, the paternalistic ethos. Planters advocated hierarchical agrarian society, once again going back to that feudalistic concept. They also were very paternalistic, in which men took personal responsibility for the physical, moral well-being of all in the plantation, their family, including slaves. Paternalism enabled slave owners to think of themselves as a kind, responsible masters that took care of the slaves, though it was brutal and viewed as property, that if they were not there, they would often have a terrible life. So very racial driven, that they couldn't self-exist on their own and such. So the pro-slavery argument is most who oppose slavery still favored white supremacy, though. So most who are going to say slavery is wrong are still going to want to subjugate African Americans to the low class. Racism for this basis. Others argue slavery was essential to human progress, and thus why this industrial change was happening in the United States was driven by it. The Old South 5, abolition in the Americas. Now, planters kept tabs on abolition in other parts of the Americas, argue that slaves did not improve lives, and that it was a failure if they were to be freed. They point to the Haitian revolution in the island of Haiti and all that. Argue that slaves did not improve their lives there, and else places revolts had happened or had the opportunity, they couldn't maintain themselves. Reality was rapid success for the it was rapid success for the former British slaves. When they were freed, they had success, and thus the southern plantationers knew some of this, and they wanted to keep it under wraps. They didn't want any hope to spring eternal on their slaves. Slavery and liberty. Now, many white Southerners viewed themselves as true heirs of the American Revolution, and the slaves were not part of that. States such as South Carolina viewed all men equal as an abnormal occurrence, where slavery was the normal, meaning all whites were equal to some degree, but slavery was necessary to preserve that. Some believe that freedom depended on slavery, and thus the connection. Now, life under slavery, slavery in the law. For slaves, the peculiar institution made a life of incessant toil, brutal punishment, and the constant fear that families would be destroyed by sale. A few rights couldn't be killed outside of self-defense and serious crimes a day in court. They had to have a day in court. Could not testify in court, though. Hold meetings without whites, leave the farm, and by the 1830s, read or write. One of the restrictions that white Southerners are going to do is remove the ability to communicate effectively or read materials that they might get that would spur them to revolt. Southern justice court system was designed to enforce the master's control over the persons and labor of his slaves, thus to assert his control. 1855, a slave named Cecilia killed her master during a sexual assault. Women could defend themselves, however, Cecilia was viewed as her master's property, not as a woman, and thus was viewed as and found guilty. She was sentenced to death, but since she was pregnant, her execution was postponed until the child was born. A horrific tale in the South, in which a mother who was assaulted and raped by her owner had to give birth and then was executed. So just a heartbreaking story. Conditions of slave life. Compared to other slaves in the West Indies and Brazil, American slaves enjoyed better lives, lower infant mortality rate, and longer life. West Indies and Brazil, slaves could be freed. The South set limits on that voluntary manumission by owners, and plus if an owner did have a moral conscience and wanted to free their slaves, the laws of the land at that time would have made it very difficult to do so. They would require approval by the legislature, and then few societies in history were so systematically closed off all avenues to freedom, and as the Old South did. Free blacks in the Old South. On the eve of the Civil War, about 500,000 free blacks lived in the South. Family was freed after revolution or gradual emancipation by some of those gracious owners. Free blacks could own property, marry, and not be sold and bought, but many laws of slaves were applied to them as well. And sometimes if they had an escaped slave that happened to be like them, they might be picked up and thrown into slavery. Let's be honest. Slaves in the South, free blacks in the South were viewed as one and the same. A few communities did prosper, like New Orleans and Charleston had a prosperous group, but the reality is most of them were being cut off from the rest of society. Slave labor. Slave labor was a system of labor, work from sunup to sundown with meal breaks. Larger plantations had numerous jobs that slaves would do. 75% of women and 9% of men worked the fields. On small farms, the owner might toil alongside the slaves, working with them, and you might have a closer bond with the slave owners and the slave workers. They would lurk in large gangs. Cotton belt overseer and perhaps a slave driver ran the farms, and sometimes the owner was not even near. If it was a rich estate plantation, the house and the slave quarters could be miles apart. Slavery in the cities. Most city slaves were servants, cooks, and other domestic laborers. Some worked in industry, especially the ironworks in the Backwoods of the Upper South. Some even lived on their own until the 1850s, when slave owners grew worried about revolts and stuff. Now, maintaining order. At the base of the system rested on force and fear. Whipped and lashing, lynchings could occur if someone was accused of a crime. Encouraged and exploited divisions among the slaves, field hands, house servants, etc. would get rivalries and basically work the drama between them. And the ever threat of sale. So as you look here, this Old South, we're looking at slavery as the peculiar institution. It really contradicted some of the things that the country had established with the Constitution, and even from the Declaration of Independence, some of our thoughts were. So as we dive into the slave culture and then resistance to slavery to end this chapter, as we get moving forward, you're going to see why slaves will take a more aggressive stance, and why, besides slaves, whites will finally start to say that enough's enough and start to resist slavery. Thank you.